Hey Legionnaires, Omegon Edge here and welcome back to another video. So we're back to our Crimson Fist and this time we're going to be focusing on the base. Let's get started. Legionnaires, it's so good to see you again and I hope you had a great Christmas and celebrated with your loved ones. It's been a wonderful time here in London as well and I've really enjoyed just finally having a break and being able to paint and get down to work that I've left on the back burner for some time. In this video, we're also going to be focusing on the dark decals as well as the base. So I wanted to make sure that you guys have access to that too, simply because people have been asking me, how do I do decals on oil miniatures? And to be honest, there's not much of a difference, but either way, I thought I'd show you. I've also got an announcement to make that I've actually started a Patreon, and that Patreon's mainly for people who are a bit more invested in oil painting and want to improve, and I can help you with that and we can spend time together and chat and also just build a community. So there's going to be a Discord channel for us to link up and sync together. There's also going to be some exclusive images as well, just works in progress, but mainly just a place for us to vibe and just hang out. So if you're interested and you really want to get better at oil paints, be sure to just continue following me here on YouTube as well as over on the Patreon and join the Discord channel. Okay, so let's get started on the model. Okay, so the decals. Now, everyone has probably seen videos on decals before, and for oil paints, it's pretty much very similar, if not the same. Big shout out to Dawn's Arrow, who actually provided me with these Crimson Fist decals. I couldn't find them anywhere. He had some spares, so he sent them to me. So the first thing to remember is just to soak our decal in water, and then what we do need is both micro set and micro sol. Micro set is what allows the decal to lift off the decal sheet, as well as some water, and then you can apply that onto the surface, and that just preps the surface of the model for that decal that you're gonna place it on. And then the micro sol dissolves the plastic and just leaving the decal itself, but all the plastic around where the decal sits on gets dissolved to the point where it's almost invisible. Sometimes that can be a bit tricky. You have some decals which are a bit more resistant to the micro sol, so what you can do is apply some gloss varnish and then some matte varnish. For us though, as you can see, it's actually not interrupting our work, and micro sol doesn't do any damage. Micro set or sol don't do any damage to the oil surface. They just don't respond to each other. So what it does do is allows the decal to take up all of that excess solution and basically react with it, but without interrupting our oil work. So I haven't actually varnished this model yet. If I was using acrylics or on a vehicle that I would paint with acrylics, I would varnish it first just to protect it, but oils just seem to not respond, so it's really easy for us and just cuts out one step. So I'm just doing that with the number 1 as well on the knee pads, and just to get some more detail on those areas that I purposely left blank. And you can see now how kind of that brings the model to life just with that extra details. Just applying the micro set, just helping the model stay in place and so it doesn't move, and then we can apply the sol to dissolve that plastic afterwards. And here's what they look like with the decals on. So you can see on the fist particularly, it's very shiny and very creased. That's because I haven't applied any solution onto it yet. So now I'm applying the micro sol, which is the red one, step 2, onto the knee pad, and I'm going to do the same thing for the shoulder pad as well. And once that's done, you should see the creases slowly disappear, and then you'll just need to hit it with a varnish. You can use any varnish that you would use with acrylic. I recommend AK matte, super matte varnish, or you can use another one from Halfords if you're in the UK. In the Warhammer universe, there is only war. Billions of lives are spent every day fought across a million worlds. Each world harboring many biomes and ecosystems. From sprawling hive worlds to icy death worlds, there is no lack of inspiration to draw from. A base is just as important as the model that sits upon it, and sets the scene and story for where our character is, and also helps to provide a narrative. Occasionally, my wife and I are lucky enough to travel around different locations, and sometimes we're able to visit some locations which can be used for my miniatures. Character artwork is also an excellent resource as it can be used to inspire you to think differently about how you base your models. Bases can be split into 3 areas: the background, the center spot, and the foreground. The background is used to tell a story about the environment the character actually is in. The center is the area that our model lives in, and the foreground is where we can place our assets to help support the story we want to tell. As we delve into more complicated scenarios and models, I'll go into more detail about how these things apply, but for now, just keep these ideas in mind. For our Crimson Fist, I've chosen this image, minus the water, to help bring our model to life. I love the mix between brown and green, but I'm also going to be adding in some warmth to support the colours I've used on the model itself, as this helps with the overall composition of the piece and created harmony. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so we're finally onto the base. So in front of me, I've got 2 tubs of epoxy sculpt, A and B. These sculpts are basically for combining, and once they've combined the 2 segments, they harden and they're really, really useful for sculpting. So they're similar to Milliput, but you get a lot more in this tub, and I think it only cost me a tenner from Amazon, so I definitely recommend using this. The reason for that is I like to make my bases quite raised and combine them with texture paint from AK, but you can also use texture paint from GW or any of the well-known brands. We're going to be using Dark Earth, but the color really doesn't matter. What matters is the flock, which I'm using from the same brand called Early Fall, and it's this kind of light green, which I kind of really like, and I think it kind of works because it's quite desaturated and boosts the model on the base. So next up, we're going to start by sculpting the base, and first I combine the bits together, and then I grab 2 bases of the similar size and I make this Oreo. And the reason for that is it gives us this raised platform for the model to sit on. So it ends up being really useful because it means that we have more real estate for the model to use, and we can be a bit more creative with the assets and the sculpting we place. Once that's done, I grab some slate and then I start prodding away on the base itself. And this basically gives us a really nice texture. I found some slate in my garden, and I've just been using it as a way to sculpt. And you can see now it gives us that texture that I mentioned, and that's that kind of randomness to that terrain has, and just allows us to get some variation overall over the entire model. And your base should look something like this. You can see that I've lowered the lower area, I've lowered the bottom area of where the model will sit on, and I've had a bit of a raised part just to bring the model up. And now I'm going to start by taking some of this paint, this texture paint, mixing it with water to thin it out, and just applying that all over the base. And this will give us that interesting texture. Any of the weird parts where, you know, our fingerprints have got in, where it's hardened, we can kind of cover that with the texture paint. But thankfully, because it's wet, it kind of seeps into those ridges and still maintains the texture that we built up using the slate. So this is really cool because it just basically gives us some more variation on our model. And this epoxy sculpt takes about 2 hours to dry completely, so 2 to 3 hours to dry completely. So really useful and very good if you've got multiple projects on at the same time. After that's done, I then like to paint over the model and just prime it, and that just makes sure that any paint we apply to it adheres properly. This is unnecessary. I don't think you actually need to do this, but it just makes it, if I want to change the color of that paint, I can do that, and it gives it some variation. So here we have Moist Soil from Flow, and it's a really dark blue tinted brown. And then we've got Sand Brown from 502 Abteilung, which is much lighter, and we're going to use that to highlight the base and create some lighter wet patches. So making our prime glaze over the model, just mixing these 2 paints together to give it that variation. Really simple. You can probably even go in with thicker paint, but this just ensures that it dries faster. For the most part, the base is actually very simple. I think actually, to be honest, this is probably the most relaxing part of the entire series, because you just have fun, just be as random, and but when you do place things, obviously just make sure that they're placed in areas that make sense. I'm just applying that soil over the model, over the base, and just over to all the crevices, watching it seep in there, and it's really effective. You can just see how oil spreads out, sort of like a contrast at this point, but with a lot more color strength and variation. So just applying that over the model in those areas, and then I'm going to go over with a lighter layer of oil just to bring in some color variation on top of the model. Taking my dry brush and just blending, very similar to what we've been doing before. Nothing really changes, but we're allowed to use Vicar paint to build up over the model. And then going in slightly brighter, I'm using a tiny bit more of the lighter color, also using some white mixed in there too. You can also use sandy scroll white, I think it's called scroll white as well, if you want to just create a bit more of a yellow tint. And then I'm going back in with that mixture into one of the deeper areas to create some recesses and just create that variation. So at this point, I've mounted the model onto the base. I've glued it using super glue just to make sure it stays there. I do recommend varnishing your model first before picking it up and applying it onto the base. That just protects the oil paint. Even though most of it would be dry by that time, we still want to make sure we don't end up smudging any of our detail. And here I'm just taking texture paint and just being very careful, making sure I've placed it areas, trying to keep off my armor if I can. And we're going to come back to kind of weathering the armor later and really making it a part of the actual base, the actual world that he's living in. Okay, so weathering now. I've picked up 502 Bitume, and I'm going to be using this to basically add some weathering and scratches, some deep gouges onto the armor that we did in the previous episode. And simply just take some of this paint, make sure you've got a really sharp brush, and just start working over those transfers. You can go into any of the areas which were still a little bit raised, or if any plastic is showing, and we can just use this to enhance the scratches and really create that chipping that we wanted after before. We could go in with a sponge and just apply that to the model as well, but I want to be a lot more specific and a bit more intentional on where I place the scratches. We don't need them everywhere. A lot of the time I see people do a bit too much weathering and they completely cover the detail they've made before. So I'm just being really specific about where I place this. And by highlighting these chips in this way, we create this kind of 3D effect, and like there's more depth to the armor itself. So the model at this point is pretty much done, but now we can start applying some of the foliage that we had using the green flock. And I'm using some PVA glue. I've had this for about, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years maybe, and I've barely ever used it. So I'm just going to be applying small dollops of that onto different areas of the paint. It does respond completely normal to oil paint as glue, so it just sits there and the oil doesn't interrupt it. So I've been doing this while the oil is still drying, so it just creates some more variation, and yeah, just have fun with this, being sure to keep what you want to add to the foreground and just make it convincing. To finish up the construction of the base, I start applying these rocks, and you can find this on any of your like local hobby stores. I've actually got this from Scale 75. I've had this since COVID, and I thought I'd just basically make use of them. We're going to paint over this to create that rocky texture that we had in our concept art, so our reference image rather, and we're just going to basically place those in different areas of the model. I then start placing painting these rocks, and I'm just using a matte primer from AK just to place the rocks, being really careful not to apply this onto the base itself. And then I go over that using Preylene Black and Scroll White, applying that over the model to create some color variation on the rocks itself. Just dry brushing and blending the colors into each other, but just create some more interest. By using the green in the Preylene Black, we stay in composition with the model, and we're making sure we've got some synergy and harmony in the base. Last up is the weathering powders, and these are so old. I've had this for, I think, since I started in the hobby, almost 6-7 years ago, that they I actually can't remember where I got these from, and the images have rubbed off. So you can use pretty much any weathering powder, and what we're going to do is we're going to be really liberal with this, and we're going to cover certain areas in this paint. So what I like to do is grab some water first. Because it was painted in oil, you can see how water just sits there, and what this allows us to do, it gives us extra time to apply some of that weathering powder on top. But the water basically lets it seep into all those ridges as it responds to the oil, and then we're going to go in with our weathering powder over that area and just paint on top of it. And here you can see me just applying some of that paint to those areas whilst they're wet. As the water evaporates, it just leaves behind the pigment. Now you can go in with a blow dry if you want, and just apply that into the same areas to warm up the spaces. I always go in wet first, and then with the blow dryer dry it out, and then I go in with just undiluted paint, undiluted texture, weathering powder, and when it dries, it creates this really matte and authentic look to the base. So from here I start to paint the rim of the base, and that just creates this unification, and it just kind of finishes the model off, and it actually looks really nice, and just creates more separation between what is gameplay and what is art, I suppose, what's the artistic section of the model. And once the model dries, there is the completed model. So thank you so much, guys, for sticking with me over these past few months. Obviously, I won't be sticking on a Space Marine for the entirety of the next tutorials as we go, but I thought this would be a really good space to start and just to teach you some fundamentals. So thanks for tuning in. So that brings us to the end of our How to Paint a Crimson Fist tutorial series. This early tutorials were basically to teach you the very basics of how I use oil paint in this new technique and show you what a model would look like from start to finish. Obviously, I wouldn't spend this long or this many weeks on one model, but in the future, I thought I wanted to give you a place where we can start from. So in the new year, we're going to be going over the very basics of oil painting from fundamentals, as well as looking at some more exciting projects such as how to paint Alpha Legion, how to use metallic paint, and how to paint a Primarch. So I'm looking forward to sharing that stuff with you, and I can't wait. Don't forget, if you like the video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to follow my progress on the Patreon and on Instagram. So God bless you guys. I'll see you soon in the new year. Take care.